you can't take the view that politics doesn't matter, given everything that it did to our family. And all three, myself and my siblings, we've all done some form of public life. So one of the things it's done is made me believe that we need to take some risks to try to defend people living where they live in peace. And it has probably led me to mistakes. It now does seem as though the war that we fought in Iraq didn't work, and those people who argued, for example, that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, which I just thought they were right. You look back at those things and think I was too gung-ho about it, but I was gung-ho about it because of my background, because for me it's never satisfactory to say, well, we can't, it's across the other side of the world, it's a long way away, we can't do anything about it, because that's people said that about Lvov as well.
Daniel Finkelstein's new book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad. He describes himself as a story of how the great forces of history crashed down in a terrible wave on two happy families. He says the story of how my family took a journey which ended up happily in Hendon, eating crusty bread rolls with butter in the Tesco cafe near the M1, but on the way took a detour through hell. And I'm delighted that Times columnists, Conservative peer, and my friend Danny Finkelstein joins me now. Danny, thanks very much for joining us to talk about, first of all, can I get out of the way? The book's amazing.
Thank you.
When Nigella Lawson said it was staggeringly good, she's completely right. It is incredible. Explain where we are and why we're here.
Yeah, we're sitting in the Wiener Holocaust Library, and Alfred Wiener was my grandfather, my mother's father. In the 1920s, he's one of the leaders of German Jews in Berlin. He's already written a tract warning against bloody pogroms, saying that our descendants will talk of bestial murders unless we do something, which of course we don't. And he begins to tour Germany, giving speeches repelling libels and slander against Jews, often his meetings being broken up by neo-Nazis or anti-Semites. And his main weapon in that fight was to try to tell the truth, to collect the truth and tell the truth. So he begins a collection of everything that the Nazis say, everything that they publish, all their uniforms, what their structure of their groups were, what their positions were on quite arcane issues. What is the Nazi position on Lithuania? What is Nazi sense of humour? Anything that you might want to know. The first time he tries that collection, it is ultimately destroyed. Goering works out that the collection exists, arrests some of the people involved, and my grandfather has to leave Germany while Goering chases and eventually forces the destruction of the original archive. But he begins again in 1934 in Amsterdam, where the family moves, and what you see is the latest iteration of that. We're in Russell Square at the Wiener Holocaust Library, and it's still a thriving collection, but with many, many millions of items which originated with that collection, which helped the Nuremberg trials, which helped the Eichmann trials, where, for instance, when people were chasing Mengele, the so-called angel of death, they thought he was in Argentina, but nobody had a photograph of him. My grandfather had a photograph of him. They collected photographs of everybody. When Hess landed here, there was a big question of whether he was landing here because he was a moderate and he wanted peace. In fact, Alfred was able to show he was a crackpot and an extremist, and he was able to ensure the library put on everybody's ministerial desk a dossier on who Hess really was.
Do you think your grandfather was collecting it because he thought they could be stopped if people only knew the truth of what he was collecting? Or had he already made the leap to, I think I know where this is heading, and I want a full record of how he got there?
No, he thought that it could be stopped. And so, the interesting question is, was he right about the power of truth? In some ways he wasn't, because he didn't stop what happened. He went round, he went, for example, to see von Papen, the Chancellor, his office, and he warned them, he gave them a dossier of what Nazis had done, agitation, cemetery destruction. And von Papen's aide says, well, I'm sure Hitler condemns this. I spoke to him yesterday and he's completely against agitation against the Jews. He is a decent man, if a little bit overexcitable. He actually said that. My grandfather wrote it down at the time. So, in some ways he hit both a combination of people not wanting to know, being very naive, and ultimately he failed to stop what happened. But then again, afterwards, his collection was vital in proving what they did, in creating a narrative about the Holocaust. So the books that you see around us not only are in the library, but often couldn't have been written without the library. And, in some of the earliest works, Gerald Reitlinger's Final Solution, he says, that he's able to reach a conclusion that there was such a thing because of the work of the Wiener Library. And so I suppose it could be said that he may not have been right about stopping the Second World War and the Holocaust, but since then it's been invaluable in warning against it happening again.
But of course, that's the story of your grandfather, and this is actually the story of your mum and dad. Let's start with the story of your mum. Growing up in Berlin, her parents conclude that actually, based on the work that your grandfather was doing, that was not a safe place to be, but chose Amsterdam as the place to go.
Absolutely. So my mother was born in June of 1933. And at that point, Alfred is actually balanced between his life in Berlin and his life in Amsterdam. He realised he was going to have to move because of the confrontation that he'd had personally with Goering, and he realised they'd have to get out. So he's going to start again. My mother's born at that point. And so I've always thought of my mother as being Dutch, because she was brought up in Holland. She went to school there, and when she talked about foreign foods and other things, it was like Dutch sweets and Dutch savoury foods, and I thought of her in that way. But obviously, when I studied, I realised, well, that's actually wrong. She's really German. They were German Jewish refugees. So in Holland, there were lots of Germans Jews who went there thinking, and the Frank family is another example of that, thinking Holland is going to be neutral. And right up to the edge of the war, one of my grandfather's associates is talking to Chaim Weizmann, the great Zionist leader, and said, Amsterdam will remain neutral. And they thought it was like Switzerland because it had been in the First World War. But of course, that had a problem for the library. My grandfather had to always work in secret in Holland because they were worried it would undermine Dutch neutrality, and that Dutch...
That it was such a powerful collection that it would be seen as an act of aggression to be hosting it.
And so when the famous pogrom occurs in Germany, known as Kristallnacht in 1938, the Jewish office that my grandfather is running publishes eyewitness statements about it, but for the first time it's traceable. They were very careful before that not to put their imprint on it. They didn't have a sign on the door, and the chairman of the office is called in by the Dutch Prime Minister, who says, you have to stop doing this, it's endangering our neutrality. And my grandfather realises he has to go to London, but what he doesn't appreciate, and neither does my grandmother, despite everything that they knew about what the Nazis would do, the one thing they didn't know was they'll come and do it here. They thought Holland would be exempt from it. So, one of the things that people often ask, and it's also true of my father's story too, is, how comes these people didn't get out? How did they stay? The answer was they didn't know where to go from or to. So to think in 1937 that Britain would be, or indeed 1939, that Britain was going to be safer than where they were, how would you make that judgment? So it would have seemed quite an odd judgment. So lots of people get trapped in places where actually the Nazis go, and that's one of the reasons why they end up in concentration camps.
Well, let's work through that story then, because so often it's a case of, by the time somebody in your story realises that they should have done something, it's too late. Your grandfather's in London, your grandmother and their daughters are still in Amsterdam. You mentioned the Frank family, Anne Frank and her family, and their stories are sort of unfolding almost side by side, aren't they? Even attending the same schools.
So that's true, but an Otto Frank has this place where the family can go and hide, the famous annex or attic. That is very rare. If you read Anne Frank's diary, you realise the infrastructure they had behind it was quite big, and even then they got caught. right at the beginning of the Nazi invasion in May 1940, Greta, my grandmother, thinks, they're going to come here first. They know about this archive. They'll probably know about Alfred. They know he's not here. They're going to come here. So they start burning everything. And then the next thing they do is they go and hide. But they realise shortly they're actually not probably looking for specific individuals at that point. And they just can't hide. There's nowhere to go. And they didn't want to split the family up. That's a consideration for lots of families. So some families are able to find places to hide. For some it works and for some it does not work. But lots of people just didn't have the place to hide or the money to do it. And, money was very scarce. My grandfather was in London, so they had no real, my grandmother found some work. But one of the things about being a refugee, in addition to this big existential problem they had very banal problems. How do they feed themselves? What do they do? My grandmother, she's got 3 young daughters and she's by herself, and yet she's got to find something to do for work, otherwise she won't be able to feed the family.
And she ends up working within the sort of the support system for other refugees. Yes. Which in one way is good because it means she was earning money, but she also knew then what was happening and that things were getting tougher and tougher, and eventually there would be the knock on the door.
Yeah, she absolutely appreciated that, and as it gets closer to June 1943, the date when they're arrested, the situation gets worse and worse. So there's been this famous event, the Wannsee Conference, which decides to move from a policy of excluding Jews from social life, which means things like segregating schooling. So if you go to the Anne Frank house, you'll see a sign which is a class list of Jews, of Germans of Jewish blood who are in the school, right? Horrendous phrase. One of them is Margot Frank, another is my aunt, Ruth. And that was, all the schools were collecting together lists of the Jewish children so they could all go to Jewish schools, which is where my aunt ends up, and where Margot Frank also ends up, although obviously leaves part of the way through it. So they progress from that to a policy of beginning to concentrate the people together, take them to this place called Westerbork, and from Westerbork people are what's called transported to the east. What that actually meant was being sent to their deaths.
And how do you piece together then that exact story of your mother, your grandmother, your aunts and so on? Because all these books around us are filled with the stories of people who didn't make it.
So look, I'm lucky. First of all, my mother and my aunts all left testimony. Something called the Association of Jewish Refugees. It's got this Refugee Voices program, and they recorded my mother for 4 hours talking about her story. She gave talks in schools. I've got a recording of one of those. So we got that. There was quite a lot of correspondence. Obviously, because my grandfather created this library, he was interested in archival, record. So he kept a lot of those documents himself, and that's how I managed to piece it together. The other thing is that anything that happened to your family, if you're listening to this and you've got a family story, it's a bit vague, but you've got 1 or 2 items of information about it. My message to you is you can piece that together. And the way that you do it is simply think, who else suffered this? And has anyone else said this? So my mother and my aunt had 2 different accounts of which trains they went on, whether they were cattle trucks or passenger trains. And they were at variance. And I had to work out which was which. But I could work it out because there were 2 books that I came across where people had been or seen the same exact train with the dates and times. And because of that, because I knew the dates and times, I was able to work out who was right, which was remarkable enough considering that she's 6 years younger, my mother actually, who got that right. And anybody who's listening to you can do the same. You can do the same thing. That information is there for you.
So let's pick up the story then when they get on the train. And take us through then what happened to them.
Well, Westerbork, which was a refugee camp that the Jews had paid for to help the Dutch put Jewish refugees from Germany. The idea was that the Dutch would let them come into the country, providing there was somewhere where the Jews paid for them to be there. This was during the years before the Nazi occupation. That is now turned over to the Germans, and the Germans run a train track right into the middle of the camp from which they can, every Tuesday, send people off to concentration camps. And my mother's aunt, Nutti, or Gertrude, however you want to call her, she and my mother's cousin and my mother's uncle, they are all fairly early on onto one of these trains. My mother always thought that this train had taken them to Auschwitz, which is the best known of such camps and where lots of people did go, but in fact they went to Sobibor. And one of the most sort of traumatic things in producing this book was learning what Sobibor was. People sometimes lived in Auschwitz because some people were sent to labour in Auschwitz, but others, if you read it, often they all go to their deaths quite quickly. And Sobibor, that happened to everybody. So the average lifespan in Sobibor was 3 hours. And reading about what happened to them, that was quite a distressing experience because I hadn't completely known it. But Sobibor, and just in parentheses, one of the things that I worked out was that John Demjanjuk, whom listeners might remember as was thought of as being Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, and I always used to joke, he's not, he'll be Schmeivan the Terrible of somewhere else. And indeed he was. He was Ivan the Terrible of Sobibor. He was there and was accused and found guilty of the murder of 28,000 people, of whom my great aunt and great uncle and my mother's first cousin were 3.
And is it because everyone who went there died so quickly? Is that why? It's a sort of terrible thing, but Auschwitz is so much better known because
That's
some
exactly
people survived.
So only 18 people and go to Sobibor and then during this main period and don't die there. And even those people were sent off somewhere very quickly, so they didn't see how Sobibor was created. But eventually there is a camp revolt in Sobibor, which is how we know of its existence. The Nazis still destroyed all the papers. My mother doesn't go on one of these Tuesday transports, and the reason for that is they have become citizens of Paraguay. And the book explains how this extraordinary thing happened. They're obviously not Paraguayan. And not only that, not only do they know they're not Paraguayan, the Paraguayans do obviously, so do the Germans and so do the Allies. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows the papers they've got are fake, but they have something critical ingredient. They provide Jews with an exchange value. And by this point in the war, Himmler thinks, I'm not sure we're going to win this. So he begins to create the idea of an exchange program. You'll all have heard, people who are listening will have heard of the tens of thousands of people who starved to death in Belsen. Belsen was created originally as a camp where Jews will be exchanged for money, for tanks, and this was the crucial thing, Germans who were in occupied countries, Allied occupied countries. And no one ever really does get exchanged. The Allies don't want to do this because it involves letting fit and able-bodied people go back to Germany and fight for the Axis. So they don't want that. So they try and stop it, and as a result, very few of these exchanges take place. One exchange does take place with 136 people in all the millions of people who died in the Holocaust, in the tens of thousands who died in Belsen. My mother is one of these 136, along with her family.
That's incredible.
Yes.
Incredible. Which meant that they could come out essentially and tell the story that so many other people couldn't.
Absolutely. And interestingly, after the war, my grandfather continues his library, obviously, as you can see, and one of the things they do is a program of eyewitness statements. And there, I won't spoil it for people, but there's a fantastic eyewitness statement from my mother's home help, which informs one of the chapters in the book. But he didn't take her eyewitness statements from his children, which was a bit of an odd thing, an odd thing to do. Anyway, however, they did give an eyewitness statement, and as a result, yes, I know all about this, and we can tell a chapter from the Holocaust, which the way that I put it is that my mother's story is an extremely idiosyncratic version of a story you'll know about. But while you'll have heard of Belsen, you won't know what it is. And while you may have imagined there might have been exchanges, you'll not understand the politics of them, and that all comes out. My father's story, which we'll come on to obviously, is a sort of standard version of a crime that you probably didn't know about.
Well, this is the thing, because you're right. In the sort of hierarchy of common knowledge, people know about Auschwitz, they've heard of Belsen. By far the much less known or studied or taught part of what was unfolding in the Second World War is your father's story. So he's Ludwig, simultaneously growing up, nice family, nice big house in Lvov, which is now Lviv, growing up in Poland. Take us through his story.
I should just say, we're in this building. there is a copy of all the Nuremberg documents, and in it, and one of the first documents actually that came out of a personal folder when I started doing the book was a copy which my grandfather had in his personal possession of the indictment of the Nuremberg defendants, and every crime that they were indicted for, all the big four main crimes, the Soviets were guilty of too, but they ended up being prosecutors rather than in the dock. My father wasn't mildly prosperous. They were rich. Yeah. That's the truth of it. Yeah. And my grandfather had the title, the nickname, the Iron King. He had him and his brother Bernard had this massive metalworks, iron and steel factories. Indeed, it has occurred to me to wonder whether the tracks that ultimately take them to their imprisonment in both cases were not Finkelstein tracks from Finkelstein steel. But they in 1938, 39, they build this incredibly modern, beautiful Art Deco house. And it's a sign of their confidence. Families live there for hundreds of years, and they live in it for a year. And the reason is that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which freed up Hitler to invade Holland, divides Poland between the Nazis and the communists. And Lvov is in the communist sphere of interest. So in September 1939, the Soviets invade that part of Poland, the city that my grandfather is doing his business in. They integrate it with the Soviet Union. It becomes Soviet Lviv, Soviet Ukraine. And in April 1940, they arrest civic leaders, wealthy people, everyone right down to kind of Esperanto speakers and philatelists, anyone who could have any kind of connection with the outside world. And they arrest my grandfather, and he disappears into the Gulag. My grandmother goes to find out the next morning where he's got to, and they say, come back in 4 days and we'll tell you what to do next. And 3 days, in other words, the night before she can do that, the family itself, the rest of the family is arrested, and they are to be sent to the interior of the Soviet Union it was known as Siberia. In fact, strictly speaking, it's Kazakhstan. And I always sort of say it was a little bit about political destruction of the Polish elite, and a little bit a kind of, I joke, Soviet levelling up. Right. So the idea was, you populate the interior with people who didn't live there, and they'll farm the land. And so they're going to live on somewhere which my grandmother referred to as an island of hunger and death, a farm in Kazakhstan.
In a way, the thing, reading the two, because there's two stories unfold alongside each other, and the Soviet story makes less sense. Not that it makes any sense what the Nazis were doing, but on their own terms, rounding up the people they didn't like and killing them had some logic. Was rounding up people and dumping them in the middle of sort of a cow shed or a field?
No, it had two. I mean, it had a sort of warped logic of its own. So it was twofold. One aspect of it undoubtedly was, look, one of the things that my grandfather is accused of is in his interrogation is strengthening the might of capitalist Poland. And he unquestionably was guilty of that. Yeah. Right? My grandfather did strengthen the might of capitalist Poland, and ultimately he's sent to the Gulag for what is effectively a life sentence. They couldn't have expected him to come out of that alive. My grandfather is sent there for being an antisocial element. And so part of it is political, and then obviously my father was 10 when he was arrested, but it wasn't going to be 10 forever. Yeah. So part of it was a political thing. They knew that even though they'd had a so-called election and they'd actually passed the power over formally to the Soviet authorities, actually people were really against it. They knew that. So this was a way of politically disposing of that, and therefore winning power in the way that rampaging conquestors of all kinds have. But there was also an economic element, right? The idea was, let's create more jobs and prosperity in places that people don't want to go to. I mean, and the way that we'll do that is turning these kind of bloodsuckers, because they were capitalists, into the working class. At one point, as their on this train. They've been 3 weeks on this train. They come out and they're given a sort of the benefit of a speech, and the speech says, you are now members of the working class, and your job is to adjust yourself to the existing members of the working class. And this class analysis, that they've been turned from people who are consuming surplus value into people who are productive. That was the idea. So there was a big ideological element of it. They actually basically, it's an admission that for all that Marx thought that all the state would wither away and everyone would voluntarily go and do these. Actually, they kind of knew they'd have to poke somebody with a rifle and put them on a cattle truck in order to get them to do it. So it's quite an admission, and there's a huge ideological element to it.
And again, your father's story is one of moments of good fortune and luck, with sitting in the cowshed while people literally died around him.
Absolutely. Look, I'm not, deliberately, because I'm hoping people will read the book. There's an awful lot of twists and turns to this story that I'm obviously not telling you now. But yes, it's quite a story, and there's an awful lot of coincidence. And you very shrewdly, I think, when you read it, said, look, the extraordinary thing is, for all the amounts of luck these people had, there were lots of people who did not have that luck, and what the result of this is that there are a lot fewer people like that, and that's absolutely right. That's a completely correct observation about it. Everybody who survives, I was always amazed, because obviously when I was a child I did meet quite often people who survived the Holocaust, or fewer, but some people who'd survived what my grandfather and my father had been through, and I was always surprised at how extraordinary their stories was. I tell the story of Betty, my mother's home help, in the book, and how amazing that story is. And I was always surprised by the uniformity with which people had these incredible stories. And then it struck me, of course they did, otherwise they'd be dead.
Yeah, because they were the ones who had those
Absolutely.
quirks of luck and fate. And then you talk as well about how, despite those extraordinary stories, these incredible experiences, how normal they seemed to be as well. And then they your mother and your father, they both end up in Hendon, eating bread and butter in Tesco.
They literally do. That's not a metaphor.
They did do that, and got on with their lives and didn't want to be defined by it.
Yeah, my mother. So Harry Borden, the photographer, does an amazing book called Survivors. He pictures survivors of the Holocaust, and he gets them each to write a few lines, and some sort of words of wisdom. My mother writes something like, "I'm a mother and a wife and a teacher and a person, and only then a survivor." And that's very much how she saw it. She was they were very happy to talk about it, though I did note, interestingly, that my father, when I wrote the book, I realised my father had left out talking about some parts of his family, which mainly were maybe a bit too painful, but nevertheless, they basically were willing to talk to me about whatever I asked about it. They were willing to talk about it, but they didn't want to live in it. And my mother was very much one for a sort of sense of proportion. She'd never have an argument about a hedge, or disapprove of her child's choice of partner, or make a big fuss about something. She didn't think it was worth it. So some people, I think, have this. They see Hitler and Stalin in everything, and my mother and father saw it in nothing. Yeah. The only thing that I would say that did come across very strongly is my father had a particularly strong view about never breaking the law. In a democratic state, he used to say, we're living in this incredible democratic society where you can express your opinion, then you ought to keep the law. And when I was at university, I used to not make mixtapes for people because it was stealing people's intellectual property rights. And that comes from it was a bit of obviously a loss of sense of proportion, but itself. But my parents did have, there were certain things. And I remember if the only time you ever get into trouble is saying I'm starving, as a way of like, can we have dinner now? Yeah. My mother hated that, and she would
justifiably.
She would go off on one about that. But apart from that, they didn't. They were immensely well adjusted.
So you talk about having a sense of proportion, your approach to democracy. How do you think their experience, the fact they talked to you about it, has affected your approach to life? The fact you are involved in politics with a very clearly sort of marked out centrist position in politics.
Yeah. So look, the first thing is, I remember at school people would say, politics are so boring and so. And my view of it is, politics it murdered members of my family. It stole everything that we had. It exiled my grandfather. He lost his precious German citizenship, which had meant so much to him. It dominated. He'd like to spend his whole life studying books on Arabic, I think, and then he has to end up spending his life going around in meetings fighting violent Nazis. So, the first thing about it is you can't take the view that politics doesn't matter, given everything that it did to our family. And all three, myself and my siblings, we've all done some form of public life. But in terms of the specific view, I think the most important thing, it has made me a moderate with possibly an overemphasis, but certainly an emphasis on stability and conservatism. So I am more suspicious than most people of wild, sweeping ideas. And I do think when you're looking for something, you have to start from where you are. And you have to sort of, I sometimes see people talking in apocalyptic terms. For example, people always go, everything in this country is broken. Well, yeah, there are some things wrong. We have to do something about it, but everything in this country is not broken, right? My father ended up being 4 days away by horse and carriage from the nearest town when he was in this farm ranch. And so you've got to reserve the language of everything's broken for things that actually merit it. And the fact that there's a train strike, or indeed that we've got some problems of funding of the health service and organisation, is not the same as everything's broken. And that may seem a quibble, but I don't think it is. I think it's important to remember how lucky we are, how extraordinary this country is for most of the people who live in it most of the time. So I think that has an effect on my overall politics. A couple of specific issues. One that people often ask me about, and one that, interestingly enough, they rarely ask me about. So the one that people often ask me about is what about refugees. And undoubtedly, being the child of refugees has made me very concerned that we should have a functioning asylum system, that we should be welcoming to people who want to come here and who need to come here, and allow them to integrate. It has not made me believe that it is practical to have a completely open immigration policy, which I think would destroy those things, because I think it would make it very difficult for us then to be able to take in anybody with any kind of degree of public consent. So I think, but it has definitely made me, more liberal. I did not, in fact, vote. I've abstained on the illegal migration bill because I thought that bits of it weren't practical, but other bits of it, particularly the Rwanda policy, I just couldn't live with. It definitely has affected my view on that. But what people don't often ask is what about my views on our foreign policy? Well, my grandfather did not want to be a refugee. Neither my in the correspondence between my grandparents on my father's side, they constantly talk about how the war will be over and they will go back to walking among the linden trees in Herbertoff Street, which is where they used to live, in the beautiful city where they used to play bridge and go for coffee mornings, and where my father had gone to school, and my grandfather's business. They never go back there. That wasn't what they wanted. So of course they wanted to be welcomed here as a refugee, but they didn't want to be refugees. And my grandfather on the other side the same, right? So one of the things it's done is made me believe that we need to take some risks to try to defend people living where they live in peace. And it has probably led me to mistakes. It now does seem as though the war that we fought in Iraq didn't work. And, those people who argued, for example, that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, which I just thought they were right. You look back at those things and think I was too gung-ho about it. But I was gung-ho about it because of my background. Because for me, it's never satisfactory to say, well, we can't, it's across the other side of the world, it's a long way away, we can't do anything about it. Because that's people said that about Lvov as well. So
which is back on the front line
so I'm
again.
obviously with that, and there are, by the way, some of the people who have been opposed to us having foreign adventures are very much in favour of Lvov. So we all have taken the action we're doing in Ukraine. So we've all moved our positions a bit on that. But I'm just trying to explain my politics. One of the things that's really interesting reading about my grandfather on my mother's side is I realised I would have made quite a few of the same errors. even though I know that now that they are errors.
Him leaving and leaving
No,
them
well,
behind.
no. Just for example, it turned out that he and the Zionists had a big argument. He basically said, we don't need a state because we can be German Jews. They said to him, if you stay there, you're all going to die. He said, if we leave, we're going to be in a constant fight with people in that country because there are people who live there already. And they were both right. That's the big tragedy. But even reading the bits of my grandfather's thinking on that were right and that were wrong, I can see I would have made the same correct arguments and the same errors. So you definitely, whether that's inherited, whether that's learnt from my mum, I don't know.
You're a bit of a hoarder as well, aren't you?
Yes. So one of the things, of course, my grandfather is like great collector, and one of the things that happens before the war, my grandmother goes to a bookseller and wraps up in wax paper the remaining parts of my grandfather's collection of quite odd Oriental knickknacks. My grandfather was a great sort of scholar of the Middle East, and so they do get them back after the war, these things, and I noticed in that the practice that I've got, which is I keep lots of stuff that will sort of tell you about my life in the same way that my mother's old cruise liner ticket told me about hers, and some that I've added to, like collecting letters of prime ministers. That's exactly like my grandfather. And I think that probably is, whether you inherit, as I say, whether they're DNA or cultural, I don't know.
Well, Daniel, honestly, it's such a terrific read, and I after I read it, I sent you a message saying that the way that all those strokes of good fortune that your parents had, which so many other people didn't, meant that there were fewer Danny Finkelsteins in the world, which strikes me as a bad thing. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And best of luck, Danny Finkelstein. Thanks for joining us.